Greetings, lovers of lore. I am pleased to be here today to share this bonus Zendikar lore video with you, because honestly, the story about the rise of the Skyclaves is too cool not to talk about. So to make sure we're all on the same page, in case you're newer to the world of Magic and you don't know what's happened with the world of Zendikar so far, the most important parts for you to know are essentially Zendikar is a mana-rich plane. The Eldrazi, which are gigantic Cthulhu-style horrors, interdimensional beings that travel around just consuming everything they come across. They found Zendikar, right? And they were basically wreaking havoc on Zendikar. They were put to sleep inside of Zendikar, imprisoned there, and then they managed to escape from that imprisonment. They wreak havoc across Zendikar again. And ultimately, they end up getting defeated. Now, when the Eldrazi are active, what it does is it activates Zendikar's Roil, okay? And the Roil is a manifestation of Zendikar's will, pretty much, that causes the surface of Zendikar to be a nightmare to live on, because the Roil causes extreme, insane weather patterns, tectonic shifts. Essentially, it's like the world has turned against you. That's what it feels like when you're facing the Roil. It's kind of like the way a body uses a fever to burn out what needs to be gone. Same kind of scenario with the Roil. So it's just tearing across the surface of Zendikar. And even after the Eldrazi have been laid low this time, Zendikar hasn't quite got the message. So Zendikar is still riled up and the Roil is still going absolutely insane. But recently, out of nowhere, these massive flying ruins have lifted up into the air above the different continents of Zendikar. And these are known as the Skyclaves by the adventurers who have found them. So those are the names that they are known by. Now, originally, these Skyclaves were created centuries before the Eldrazi even found their way to Zendikar. They were part of the Core Empire, which is interesting to note because up until this point, the Core have only appeared to us living a very sparse and nomadic life. They have very few possessions, basically only what's essential for survival. They value just being able to be self-sufficient, having what you need, the strength to survive in all of these tough conditions. That was what we knew the Core as. But when you go back centuries, the Core Empire actually stretched across the entirety of Zendikar. They started with a noble goal. Their goal was to unite the world essentially in peace and harmony, so there would be no more conflict between different cities and governments and things like that. Now, they succeeded in their goal in unifying the world, but unfortunately, as happens in a lot of cases where this is the situation, it starts to become really oppressive for the inhabitants of Zendikar. Those living under the rule of the Core found their specific type of law and order to be incredibly repressive for them. And so all across the world, these little pockets of resistance started to form within different communities. And as this happened, the natural response from a gigantic empire that's aimed on keeping everybody under their control is to become more oppressive, right? So essentially they turn from the good guys into the evil empire. And so as part of this, the Empire Stoneforgers actually built 7 Skyclaves. Now these were massive, sprawling military bases. They served as centers of government. They were like giant flying, miniature-sized cities compared to the biggest cities, but they were large flying cities that were powered by what were essentially miniature suns. So there was a lot of magical power that went into keeping these things aloft. And by using these Skyclaves, the Core were able to enforce their rule over all of the other races, civilizations, whatever you want to call them, of Zendikar. They were able to maintain absolute power for a time. Obviously, when you don't have the support of the people, your empire is doomed to fail at some point. So over the span of about 100 years, the Skyclaves fell one by one. Now, the capital of the Core Empire was at Makindi, but each of these different skyclaves were located around the world. So over in Goldraz, it was actually the royal, the Zendakar's manifestation of its own rage, reached up into the sky and dragged Goldraz down into a swamp, basically. It not dragged Goldraz down, sorry. It dragged the skyclave above Goldraz down into the swamp and submerged it. So nobody was even aware of these ruins because they were buried deep inside of a swamp, right? Now, this just happened as a side effect of the royal, right? The royal isn't a consciously directed sort of force where Zendikar just said, I don't like that skyclave, I'm going to reach up and pull it down. It's more just Zendikar's royal is the equivalent of a temper tantrum where you can't tell exactly what's going to happen. So the royal yanks the first skyclave down into the Goldraz swamp, right? The second skyclave was toppled when the Bala Ged elves actually banded together and revolted against Kor rule. There's a number of these skyclaves that are actually taken down as a result of oppressed people rising up and freeing themselves. But the Bala Ged elves were the first to take the stand and take down the skyclave that was in their part of the world. In Murasa, it was another force of nature style event that caused the destruction of that skyclave, and that was done by a gigantic sea beast of some type. It could have been Lorthos the Tidemaker, or it could have been one of Lorthos's ancestors. Nobody is actually sure. They just know it was a massive sea creature that reached up and dragged the skyclave above Murasa deep down into the depths. So we have another ruins just completely submerged. In Ondu, basically the skyclave there turned against the core capital of Makindi. So you had the Ondu skyclave and the Makindi capital that were actually against each other because at that point the core were embroiled deep in a civil war. So as a result of this, that skyclave over Ondu was destroyed and it fell onto the Jawar Isle. After that, over in Akum, the Kargans that lived there, they mastered the art of dragon taming and dragon riding, and as a result, they were able to fly a score of dragons up and essentially just completely shatter the skyclave that had kept them oppressed, right? So it continues on in that fashion. Over Tazim, it is different in Tazim. You have a situation where Iona, the big archangel Iona, she essentially flies off to deal with the Eldrazi situation that's going on, and she abandons the sky ruins of Maria, and they essentially just are left. These are the ones that are just left kind of the most untouched overall, and the last skyclave was destroyed in kind of the most amusing way. Okay, this is the one that was over Sijiri, and when Sorin, Nahiri, and Ugin worked together to lure the Eldrazi to Zendikar, just as a side effect of the Eldrazi being there, basically a loose tentacle flick, not even aimed at the skyclave, just a tentacle flick from one of the Eldrazi just smashed the skyclave right out of the sky, and it ended up crystallized in a sphere of polar ice. So that's how all the skyclaves originally felt, right? So the sky ruins that Iona left were unguarded, and what happened as a result of that one being unguarded was a bunch of explorers were able to eventually make their way in there. So they wandered through the ruins, and as they did so, they triggered the defense systems of the skyclave. And as a result, it not only awakened that skyclave, the Tazim skyclave, and started to have it rise back up into the air, but it actually reawakened all 7 skyclaves, which all started to rise up in the air. However, there was a difference this time. The skyclaves had been turned into shattered ruins. So there's all these gigantic, essentially chunks of these cities that have now become they're basically their own dungeons. They're their own areas to be explored, full of wondrous treasures, but also full of their own life forms that had evolved over time in their particular environments. So they literally, in some ways, look like the buildings that they reside in because they've adapted camouflage patterns based on their surroundings, because they have been in these ruins successive generations, evolving and growing over time. So each chunk of these skyclaves represents a different dungeon to be explored. And as a result, there are multiple expedition houses now that are on journeys to collect all sorts of treasures out of them. One of the most notable treasures to come out of these ruins was actually the Dragon's Frill, I should say. The Dragon's Frill, which is a collar-like necklace with red gems around it that not only offers protection from flames, but also gives you limited control over flame magic as well, and regular flames. So there are some incredibly potent and wondrous mystical artifacts coming out of these dungeons, which has created a stampede of adventurers that want to go and make a name for themselves, gain a bunch of wealth, and essentially just become powerful and live the good life. So that is the story of the Zendikarian Skyclaves thus far. I have to say, I am pretty hyped up about this. This is some pretty cool lore. Let me know what you think in the comments below. If you enjoy magic lore and want to help support the channel, I do have a Patreon. That is the best way to support what I'm doing here. Thanks for coming by. Hope you enjoyed the bonus lore video. And remember, my friends, lore is life.